afternoon, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to our annual Somali Academics Mini Research Symposium. My name is Faisal, and I'm joined here today by Dale, and together we'll be your virtual MCs for today.
Yeah, so just before we get into it, just an overview and some housekeeping rules. So we have three research talks, and each talk will be followed by a short Q&A. And for the questions that you have, please feel free to put them down in the Zoom box below, or you can tweet them out using the hashtag Somali Researchers.
So why a research symposium? So we decided to host this research symposium as it allows our Somali researchers to have the opportunity to present their research to a wider audience. And we decided to host this event the day after our PhD Insight Day, because it gives the opportunity for students who were at yesterday's event to actually see some of the amazing work that's been carried out by our fellow Somali peers.
Just a brief schedule of today. So we have speakers from both STEM and social sciences, and each speaker is allocated 15 minutes to present their research, and that will be followed by a short 5-minute Q&A session that is relevant to their topic. But if your questions don't get answered during those 5 minutes, don't be afraid, because at the end we'll have a panel discussion where we can ask the speakers more questions. So just to start off, we're going to start off with Mohamed, and she is a final year PhD candidate in the University of Cambridge, and her research focuses on urban post-conflict reconstruction in Somalia and contested memory and urban belonging after war. She's also the co-creator of the amazing On the Things We Left Behind podcast, and that won the first ever podcast competition last year. So please, Mohamed, the virtual floor is yours.
Well, thank you all so much. I'm really, really excited to share this platform, and thank you, of course, to Somali academics for creating a space like this and carving it out. It is really, really so necessary. So I will talk a little bit about my research, and I'll talk a little bit about my pathway into academia, but I also will attempt to kind of focus these remarks around the curation of what might be a successful PhD application, and giving you some practical tips, some ideas of how to embark on this process that can really be so opaque and so difficult to do. And so unless you have that guidance, unless you have people who have kind of walked those steps before you, it's difficult to know how to actually embark on something like this. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Inshallah, this will work. Okay, so a little bit about me. There we are. So you want to do a PhD, pathways to research in the social sciences. So who am I and why am I talking to you today? My name is Qasim Mohamed, and I'm a 4th-year PhD student at the University of Cambridge. Inshallah, this will be my last year, one step at a time. I'm also the co-creator of the On Things We Left Behind podcast with my sister, and you can find us on Twitter at the following handles, just in case you want to connect with us. And I will also write my email into the chat box if there are any further questions. A bit about my research. My research concerns conflict-related property disputes in the Somali capital city, Mogadishu. I investigate how contestations over the built environment in contemporary Mogadishu actually map out contestations over the city and the ways to navigate the city and how to belong to the city in the aftermath of war. And as such, my research kind of sits at the intersections of what I consider to be urban conflict studies, which study other divided cities, such as everywhere from Jerusalem to Belfast to Kigali, and memory studies, which is about the contested histories that form and are created after war, and Somali studies, of course. So in these kind of ways, my methodology kind of approaches this from a two-pronged kind of way. In one angle, I'm trying to kind of map out what I'm considering to be different histories of property regimes from Mogadishu, going all the way back to the colonial era. And it was a lot of like desk research and in-person documents and things like that that helped me to carve out a kind of trajectory and history of that work. And then I also conducted oral histories with individuals going through conflict-related property disputes. Either they were engaging in conflict-related property disputes as claimants, or they had petitions made against them. And I also conducted several semi-structured interviews with policymakers, people in the upper house, as well as the lower house of parliament, as well as the Somali federal government, as well as the IGOs, as well as the UN UNISOM, as well as the regional administration, to kind of get a sense of what the political dynamics were at stake here. But to get there and to get to this place where I can actually tell you in a few sentences what my research actually was quite a bumpy journey. And so in order to be able to avoid you guys making the same mistakes as I did or having the same kind of concerns, I think it's important to kind of reflect on those bumps in the road. So I knew from quite a young age, quite early on in undergrad, that academia was something that was interesting to me. It was something that I was passionate about, and it was something that I wanted to pursue, but I had no idea how to get there, right? And I effectively was trying whatever I thought would work, and it wasn't working for me. So I have a whole litany. I can create a whole failed CV of fellowships that I didn't get. Even Cambridge, I applied to the master's the year before that I ended up going there, and I didn't get in. And a number of different things and experiences that kind of tested my resolve in order to be able to do this. And through this, I ultimately found a mentor really who took me under her wing. And I wanted to kind of use this space today to share with you what she shared with me, and to create those networks and collaborations amongst different kinds of Somalis, and also to create networks of mentorship within the community and without. So mentorship is absolutely critical throughout this process, but also failure is a part of it. If you know the life of an academic, you know that every journal article has a number of different processes that you go through, revision, and so you shouldn't take rejection as a no. It's not an investment or an investigation of how valuable you are and your contribution. So I'm going to kind of frame my remarks around 3 different kinds of ways to think about the doctorate. The first piece is good reasons and other reasons to pursue a PhD. I would never tell anyone that their reason wasn't a good reason to pursue a PhD, but there are certain cautions that we want to have around how to pursue it. Then the doctoral application, a bit of practical advice specifically revolving around the research proposal specifically, and how we can get that into something that can be very useful to you. And then finally, just a few reflections on what I wish I knew, surviving and thriving throughout the doctorate. So all of these remarks are kind of aimed towards people who are trying to do research in the social sciences, research that's effectively going to be anchored in attempting to unearth, uncover, or create bigger understandings in different kinds of political and social dynamics. So why would you want to do a PhD? It's a question I ask myself all the time now. In the 4th year, you tend to ask yourself that question. So there are really good reasons, right? And there's every person has their own reason. One could be that you have a really clear idea about the research that you want to do and you want to conduct, and you're really excited about it. And it's something that makes you really enthusiastic, right? That's really great, because those kind of ideas can actually generate you through the lulls and give you more fuel, really, and push you through in those times where your project isn't going as well as you might have hoped, or you're second guessing yourself. So that's a really great reason. You also might want to pursue a career that a PhD is absolutely necessary for. And in this economy of upskilling, that's a lot more than you might think. So it's not just lecturers anymore. It might be certain consulting positions or work in intergovernmental organizations. And you think that a PhD will make you more competitive for that work. And so you're willing to do that. That's great too. Or you want to develop the ability to manage a research project by yourself. And that's something that you are really interested in. The PhD can be very solitary, specifically in the social sciences. And you know that that's something you want to conduct. That's really great. But there are trade-offs, right? This doctorate is not something that's super easy on the soul. 4 years, 3 years of really a lot less pay than you probably would be getting in other kinds of areas, in industry, and commensurate to your experience and to your skill level and to your knowledge level and to your level of expertise. It might mean that you have to live in a city that you're not too keen on, or you might be interacting with people that wouldn't be your natural cohort or your natural colleagues. So there are certain kinds of trade-offs. And this is where, if you don't know what else to do, right? If I don't know what else to do, and therefore let me think about a doctorate, is kind of the way that you're approaching it, it can kind of tear down those difficulties. the PhD can be a poor substitute for whatever other option it is that you're considering, because there are a lot of trade-offs. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to know that you want to do a PhD in order to do it. It's every single person who's on this call absolutely can. It's just a matter of whether it works for you or whether you want to. And those are the kind of considerations that I would think through. So you've thought about this, you've done your soul searching, and you've decided that a PhD is actually something you do want to do. Now what, right? So on every single application, you're going to see a number of different components. Often in social sciences, they're composed of some or all of the following elements. You got the research proposal, the funding application, which may be a part of the application with your PhD, or it might be external to that. And then you have your CV, and then you have your references, right? The only thing that I'll really talk about in depth other than the research proposal right now is the references, which is to say, you have to identify individuals who are very familiar with your work. You have to identify people who know what kind of contribution you're attempting to make and who can speak about that. And you have to give them time in order to be able to do so. That's the only thing that I'm going to really say about references. Most of my conversation today is going to really center on the research proposal, because in conversations that I've had with people on selection committees, the research proposal in the social sciences is really the standout piece of your application. It's the piece that's going to decide, and it will make people think whether or not this person is a fit for this department or whether this person is a fit for some other place, right? And central question that you're trying to answer is to the selection committee. If you could say to them in one sentence, you need to answer this question: can this person complete a doctoral program, right, that mounts an original argument? Because that's the central contribution that they're looking for people who are doing doctorates within the allotted time, right? And this little amendment here scopes out what kind of thing is feasible within the possibility of the constraints of 3 years. Now, you might not know what's possible within 3 years, but if you float your idea enough in front of enough people, they'll start to tell you that that sounds like a longer project, or that sounds like it would need a bit more work. So narrowing your project is something that would be super important here. They're also going to be looking at your application to see who will supervise this person's research. Are they interested and are they available? This might be something that's very useful to you. In my discipline, it's very normal for people to reach out to supervisors in advance and to establish a relationship with them in advance of submitting an application, because that person is really the other person in your project. It's just the two of you. And so they have to have an investment in order to be able to be interested. And then the last question they're going to be asking themselves is, how can we as a department support this research? And that's something you're going to have to answer to as well. What kind of research clusters exist in the department? Devour their website, figure out what's there in order to be able to figure out how you fit, and try to use their language back to them, right? Say they have an emphasis on conflict and violence, and your work is on gendered violence. That fits perfectly. Show them that they have a gap that you can fill, right? So your job is really to make it easy for them to answer these questions. And so they know who you are as a holistic researcher. This is that incredible step that you make between being a student and being a scholar, and that you have to demonstrate to them that you can make that transition. But the most important thing is, the proposal is not a legally binding document. My proposal has almost nothing to do with the research that I ended up composing, other than the fact that there are certain core themes. You're not going to be held to the proposal that you do if you're doing a social sciences doctorate often. There's an expectation that you're going to evolve over time. You're supposed to show that you have a doctorate-like idea, and that's your main contribution in this, right? So obviously, to get a research job, which is what a PhD is, you have to do your research. You have to know what it is that the department is offering and what they're not, right? So one thing that I would suggest you don't do, I'm going to start with the don't column. Don't start with, I'm a master's student at somewhere university, right? That takes away the opportunity for you to actually start with a really interesting series of questions, or an investigation, or to introduce them into the really critical work that I know you're trying to prepare for them to do, right? Don't forget to cite inside of the course of the research proposal. These are academics. They want to see whether you're thinking with some scholars or thinking with some others, right? And try to cite strategically. People don't say this often enough. Your supervisor should probably be in your bibliography for this thing, right? And so don't forget to say why their department is the best for your research. Have a clear research question, which you state as a question somewhere in the text, and demonstrate how you're going to answer this. And that's going to be your methodology piece. You have to be able to demonstrate that you know what you're doing. And specialists or non-specialists could be reading this, right? So you might have the world's most knowledgeable person on your thing reading this, or you might have someone who's dealing with something completely different, and they need to both be able to speak intelligibly about what you're doing. And this is the piece that I was saying before. It might be worth it to contact the supervisor in advance, and they expect it, right? And so this is the structure. I'm going to send this PDF or this PowerPoint over to the Somali academics team after this is over. So don't feel like you have to like rushing write it all down. But a natural flow or a natural structure that kind of comes from this, if you're confused, is like some kind of engaging introduction that says something really interesting and shows that actually the way that we've been thinking about this is missing something. And I'm, in fact, the person who's going to fill that. That's your job, right? Then you're going to pose your research question and you're going to show that it fills that gap. And wouldn't it be great if they paid you in order to do that? And then you're going to set up your methodology. In fact, I know I can do this in 3 years, and I've thought about it, and here's what I'm going to be doing. And if there's something specific about the work and your connection to it, this is where you would introduce that. I've worked in this area. I have these connections. In fact, I know that I can get into this building, or I can get into that international organization to do my research because I've already been there, or I speak this language, whatever it is that actually makes you the perfect person. That would be a great place to put it. And finally, you have to conclude with this because they want to know like that they're the only one for you. In fact, you've been dreaming about going to somewhere university since the beginning of time, and you need to tell them why that's the case, right? Of course, don't neglect the other parts of the application. They're not all going to get this amount of intense view in my kind of conversation today. And especially the funding opportunities are going to be quite critical. But the referencing, trying to start early, developing a relationship with your referees is a really critical part. This is kind of like the final piece that I'm going to add to this conversation, and then I can kind of speak a little bit about the research process for me so far. What I wish I knew. The doctorate is a difficult process, right? And even as someone who really knew that this is something that I wanted to do for a long time, I found that the doctorate kind of hits every person in a different kind of way, depending on how you do it, right? I'm someone who has difficulty with procrastination, so project administration was my personal behemoth. Others have found that they're very methodical, but the routine of it, right? And like, because they're so methodical, they don't have the ability to think expansively anymore, or they found difficulty with reading for pleasure, right? There are different kinds of ways that we can kind of think about that. The important thing about that, and the reason why I say that is not to dissuade anybody from doing this. I think you should do it. I think you just need to create the networks to support you and protect you through this process. And so I've got some amazing advice over the years that I'd love to share. Yasmin Duale, she put this on Twitter the other day. She's an amazing Cambridge PhD student as well. She said, the imposter syndrome is here to stay. Your task is to develop strategies to manage it, right? From my supervisor, Adam Branch, when I was freaking out in one of our first meetings, this is the best advice I've ever gotten. He said, this will not be your masterpiece. You have your whole life for that. This is to show that you have the ability to create your masterpiece, right? This is a tick box exercise. It's not that much pressure, right? From my sister, Sarada, she said her main thing, she's not doing a doctorate, but in graduate school, it was important for her to know who to take advice from and who not to take advice from. Learning that not everybody has your best interests at heart, unfortunately, and that some people are trying to persuade you, not because they think you can't do it, but they think they can't do it, right? And from Tracy McMillan Cotton, the amazing sociologist, the institution cannot love you back. So however, whatever romantic relationship you have with this idea of academia, it's not going to have those same romantic attachments towards you. So the important thing is to create those networks of solidarity, of support and space in order to be able to do it. And this is the piece where I'll kind of bring it to my own personal experience during the course of the doctorate. It was quite isolating. My entire cohort, I was the only one studying the global South in the Department of Politics. Forget about the continent of Africa. forget about Somalia specifically. And so often it felt like people were speaking a language that I wasn't involved in. They were all doing their own thing with their Europe scholarship, and I was doing something else, right? But there's something very valuable of doing something else. You get to think in expansive new ways that you hadn't had the opportunity to even imagine before, right? And then you have to create that community elsewhere. So I have this amazing network now of cross-continental Somali doctoral social studies students ranging from the US to the UK to everywhere, because we have something in common and we have something that we're trying to speak against and we're trying to deconstruct. And now it's been really beautiful to come out of it. And that's where I find my solidarity. That's where I find my community. And this space could be that for you. And so speak honestly about what your experiences are. Don't be afraid to speak back to the really difficult and problematic conversations that are happening about our communities in these academic spaces. But know that you're not the only one who's trying to do that, and make sure you're joining forces with the other people who are. And so I know that that wasn't as much about my actual doctoral research as maybe it could have been in this context, but I hope that that was useful for you all, and thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was actually a very insightful talk, to be honest. Yeah, I really like the way you kind of touched upon like the PhD application process for social science degree, because I think with STEM it contrasts because kind of the funding's already there, the project is already there, everything's already formulated, and you have to demonstrate that you have the competencies to do that. But in social sciences, the other way around, kind of you have to come with the projects and show that you, So yeah, that's actually.
You're the only one who knows your project, and often your supervisor will be the one who is like, they're your cheerleader, but it's just you, at the end of the day. So there's a very interesting kind of dynamic there of like trying to develop that and having the confidence in order to be able to do so. It's not easy, but I think.
Yeah. Wow, that's amazing. So we're just going to start off with one question that we have. It's what are the skills needed by social science PhD graduates to prepare them for careers both within and beyond academia?
Yeah, so there's another really important aspect of this. You don't have to come preset with all of your knowledge already into the doctorate, especially with a social science doctorate. The first year is all about doing your research methods certifications, if you have any, developing whatever linguistic skills you're going to need to be able to go into whatever field work you're going to be able to do. As long as you have an idea and you've done your amount of research in order to know what it is that you want to be able to accomplish, that's really important. Now, I don't know about the technical work. I know that there are certain fields such as geography that have, like, for example, GIS. I don't think that's something that you would be able to learn in the course of the year, or a particular kind of statistics work. But for the more qualitative research, if you come to the PhD with a sense of what it is that you're trying to accomplish, and you go to whatever social science, at Cambridge, it's called the Social Science Research Methods Center. And they have a number of different courses that they run throughout the course of the year. So I took academic, Italian for academic purposes so that I could try to start reading some of the documents. I took oral history courses, discourse analysis courses, content analysis courses, all of that stuff in order to be able to just make sure that I knew what it was that I was trying to do. And if it's a project like that, if it's something that's qualitative, then you don't have to be super uber trained. And usually by the time you're in your doctorate, you've had some research experience of some kind to be able to, so that you can gauge where it is that you're coming from.
Yeah, okay. No, actually, just to follow on from that question, because I think you've answered already part of it. It's did you have the research method skills you needed for your PhD? If not, how did that impact the early stages of your journey?
I did, in the sense that I had already conducted independent research before I started my doctorate. And so that was a really good, useful experience. In fact, I did it in and on Somalia. And so that was something that I did during the course of my undergraduate degree. And so I had a bit of understanding of how how to navigate different kinds of data collection processes, how to do data analysis when you have multiple languages, and those kinds of hiccups I had already had a method of dealing with. But there are a number of people that I know who, by the time that they arrived at their doctorate, mostly they had work experience, like work experience. And so they were doing archival research, for example, and it was their first time in the archives. And that's just fine. Like, you know, you're not supposed to be a doctor by the time you start your doctorate. You're supposed to develop that over the course of your degree. So that's just fine, like, you know. And if that's something that you're concerned about, and it really depends on what research skill it is, that's something I would actually have a conversation around with my supervisor, and say, this is the way that I'm hoping to wrap out this project. This is how I want to do this. Does this make sense to you? What do you think I need to know in order to be able to do that? And is that something I should bring to the doctorate, or is that something that I can develop during the course of it? And they can be really useful to you.
Okay, nice.
So I've got a very quick question I wanted to ask as well. So you've mentioned some of the reasons why you should do a PhD and some of the skills you can acquire from doing a PhD. So now you've recently launched an amazing podcast series whilst doing your PhD, which is quite impressive. So do you mind talking about how some of the skills you've learned as a PhD student which have contributed towards the success of the podcast series?
Yeah, alhamdulillah, it was an amazing situation. It's something, the On Things We Left Behind podcast, something I created alongside my sister. For me personally, it's better when I'm doing my research to have something else going on at the same time. So that way I have artificial deadlines and constraints because I know I have to spend this amount of time working on this. So I better be working on my doctorate right now. That's kind of how I do that kind of internal balance. So it's really helpful for me to have more than one thing going at the same time to give me that energy going forward. All the skills that were necessary during the course of the doctorate also became necessary in new ways during the course of the podcast. We were doing interviews with vulnerable people, right? Not necessarily vulnerable people, but people who had difficult stories to tell. And so I brought a lot of my ethical training to that. I knew how to ask for informed consent, how to speak to somebody who might be telling a very sensitive story, how to kind of structure an interview in a way that also generates really important conversations, but doesn't attempt to kind of exploit that and sensationalize it and to draw that out. And so during the interviewing process, that was really, really helpful. Those skills that I learned from my doctorate translated right in. The script writing process also, learning how to cut, that was something that I learned during the course of my PhD, because often people don't write, it's 80,000 words, and that sounds really scary when you start, and you find yourself, oh, I'm running over 100, 150, and now you're trying to figure out how to get it down. And that, like, figuring out what is the core of the argument that I'm trying to make here, that was something that was really transferable and really useful as well. Yeah, like tracking people down and all of that kind of stuff. The raw skills that you learn while you're trying to develop a PhD, while you're stumbling through it, could be incredibly useful in ways that you never anticipated.
Thank you for that answer. So we're just going to take one last question. It's quite a multi-layered question. Then we can take more in the panel discussion later on.
Inshallah.
So that question is, or questions, why did you decide to do your work on Somalia? And you mentioned tackling problematic issues. And so can you highlight what these issues are and how you can tackle them?
Yeah, so my research, it's almost like the research part followed the interest in Somalia than the other way around, if that makes sense. I've always been concerned with questions around conflict resolution, justice in the aftermath of war. Those were all questions and ways into understanding the Somali political conflict, right? And from a personal level, obviously, we all have these kind of histories where exile is a part of our personal lives. And that's something that I've always tried to investigate and understand a bit more. Where the problem comes in is, and this is why spaces like Somali Academic are so critical, is that we don't have many Somalis, at least yet, telling those stories for us. The truth is, if you start with Somali studies in academia, you're often going to have to start by reading a colonial anthropologist called I.M. Lewis, whose work is still reproduced as natural fact about how Somali political organizing and social structures exist. And competing with that is quite difficult when we have an entire political industry of knowledge production around Somalis that is not controlled by Somalis, that doesn't respond to Somali needs, that doesn't, often people don't even speak enough Somali in order to be able to conduct that research. And a lot of these researchers can't go to the Somali territories. They do their research from Nairobi and hire a research assistant in the Somali territories in order to conduct it for them. Like, shots fired, but it's true, right? So here's the thing. When that research contends with or contrasts with the ways that other people within the community express their lived experience, I have a problem with that. And speaking back against that is something that's really important. And so the work that comes out of having these communications and having these connections in order to be able to say, in fact, you're not crazy. You're not the only one who's realized that there's something very weird about how Somalis are theorized in this space and who wants to do something about it, has been absolutely critical. And now, like, there's, even in the US, there's loads of Somalis in history and social sciences across the board who are starting to actually take up tenure track positions at universities. So we have the opportunity really to, we're at the beginning of something really special, to really start taking back that narrative that's been constructed about us and how our politics works that doesn't really correspond with how Somalis understand themselves to be. I hope that was useful.
Yeah, I think that's a very amazing and powerful answer. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure to have you on. So there's a few questions coming in, but we'll have to delay them for the panel discussion later on.
Sure.
Yeah, so our second speaker is Ikram Abdi, and she's a final year PhD candidate at the University of New South Wales in Australia, and she's a mixed methods researcher and uses both qualitative and quantitative tools to carry out her research, and that's exploring the barriers to immunization in refugee and communities. So Ikram Abdi, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dale. Hi, everyone. So I'll just share my screen quickly. Okay, so hi, everyone. So my name's Ikram, and I'm currently in my final year of my PhD here in Sydney. And so my research just explores immunisation in refugee and migrant communities, and I look at the barriers, facilitators, and future directions. So I won't go into the details of how to apply for a PhD here in Australia because the audience here is primarily from the UK, but rather what I'll do is I'll talk about my research. I'll give a bit of background of what I do, and then I'll just end with some tips. So just a bit of a background. So I completed a Bachelor of Medical Science with a major in neuroscience, and then I went on to do a Master's of Public Health, and I've just been on this PhD journey since 2017. So a lot of you guys are probably wondering, how the hell do you go from neuroscience to public health? And the fact of the matter is I've always been very passionate about these two areas of science, but it was only during my Master's of Public Health that I realized I wanted to pursue research in this area, with the hopes of obviously going back to Somalia in future and working on some projects there. So just in terms of work on the side of my PhD, I teach in the undergraduate medicine program, and then I also work as a research assistant on various projects. So just a bit of context on my PhD and my thesis. So a lot of the immunisation programs available in low and middle income countries include fewer vaccines when compared to Australia's national immunisation program. And because immunisation plays a very important role in preventing the risk and spread of infectious diseases, under-immunisation of certain subgroups is a major public health concern. And as a result, it can lead to infectious disease outbreaks in the wider community. So what exactly is the problem? So in Australia, like a lot of the studies conducted with refugee and migrant communities have shown that they have low immunization coverage. And a lot of these low coverage rates have been attributed to, you know, barriers at both a systemic level and a personal level. And a lot of the studies conducted here in Australia have discussed the barriers, but there are very limited studies actually looking into the possible facilitators and strategies that can be implemented to improve vaccine uptake. And this is where like my first study comes in. And for this study, we explored the barriers and facilitators of immunization in East African migrants and refugees. So a lot of the studies conducted in Australia with East African immigrants have shown that they have low immunization coverage. And I guess the aim of this study was to see whether there were any underlying attitudes, possible barriers and possible facilitators that can be used, you know, to improve vaccine uptake in this subgroup. So this was a qualitative study. We conducted 17 semi-structured interviews. We interviewed adults from Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia, and South Sudan who have been living in Australia for about up to 5 years. And then we conducted thematic analysis and we used the program in vivo to analyze the data. So some of the key results, so the key barriers identified was that, so the language barriers, low risk perception, a lack of education. In terms of facilitators, we found that reminder systems. So a lot of the participants alluded to the fact that many GP practices in Australia did do follow-up vaccine reminders, but others didn't. So I guess the key here is consistency. Translated resources, and also the dissemination of resources through, you know, community organizations, because they're a key point of contact for these refugees and migrants. So some of the key conclusions from this study was that, you know, we still need to conduct more research with regards to how education about immunization is actually delivered to communities. Another key finding that arose from this study was that a lot of the participants said, when I asked them about whether they had access to resources, a lot of the participants said that they actually didn't. And if they did, it was very hard to read. And this is where my second study of my thesis came in. And we conducted an audit of the online immunization information available to refugee and migrant communities. And we assessed the health literacy demand and also the cultural appropriateness of these resources. So just a bit of background. So the internet obviously is a source of health information for many consumers now, and not much is really known about the availability of, you know, online resources about immunization for both adults and children directed at refugee and migrant populations. So the aim of this study was for us to assess the health literacy demand. So according to its 3 components, which is understandability, actionability, and readability, as well as the cultural appropriateness of the resources for these communities. So in terms of the methods, we had 2 search approaches. So firstly, we used Google Trends to identify the key terms that are used in Australia. And then for the second component, we sent out requests directly to key stakeholders in local health districts and state and territory health departments. In terms of the tools we used to make the health literacy demand assessment, to assess the health literacy demand, we use the PMAT, the SMOG tool, and the Flesh Readability Ease tools. And to assess cultural appropriateness, we use some additional criteria developed by the Centre for Culture, Ethnicity and Health down in Victoria. So the next few slides just have a few screenshots of the tools that I use. So this is the PMAT tool. This is the additional criteria that was developed by the Centre for Culture, Ethnicity and Health. This is the readability assessment tool. So there's an online readability calculator. You just copy paste the text into this red box and then it gives you a score and the reading difficulty level. So in terms of the results, we analyzed 27 resources. What we found was that a lot of the resources were understandable and very few resources met the cutoff for actionability. In terms of the readability level, it was there was a score of 10.5, and this was indicative of the fact that a lot of the resources had a reading level of, you know, the 11th grade. Just some key conclusions arising from this study. What we found is that there are currently not many refugee-specific resources on immunisation. And a key thing that we need to be doing is we need to be engaging with, you know, members from migrant communities so that appropriately tailored resources are actually co-developed rather than being developed for them. So this is my third study of my thesis, and with this one, we wanted to look at the data side of things. So we used linked data to actually do this study. So with this study, we looked at vaccine coverage in children born to migrant mothers, and it was a population-based cohort study. So just some context. So Australia's National Immunisation Program is actually one of the most comprehensive in the world. Currently, infant immunisation coverage is at more than 90%. And whilst this actually looks good on paper, there are still pockets of under-immunised children, including children from migrant backgrounds.
Sorry, Ikram, you muted yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah, okay, cool.
All right, cool.
So infant immunisation coverage is at more than 90%, but we still do have pockets of under-immunised children, especially some that come from migrant backgrounds. So I guess the aim of this study was to examine the on-time coverage of a particular vaccine, so the DTP vaccine, and we looked at a particular dose, and we wanted to see whether there were differences in coverage in the different maternal regions of birth, and also to determine what factors were associated with these differences. In terms of the methods, we developed logistic regression models to help determine the factors associated with on-time coverage, and we conducted our analysis in SAS. Okay. So in terms of the results, I can't really go into too much detail because it's currently under review in the journal. But so some of the key findings were, coverage was highest in children born to mothers from Southeast Asia and Southern Asia in comparison to Australia. And, smoking during pregnancy, young maternal age, the number of previous pregnancies were all associated with lower on-time coverage. So just see some key conclusions from this study. On-time vaccination rates obviously differed by maternal region of birth. And what we found was that, more research is actually needed to determine the main reasons for a lot of these remaining differences, because the data set we had didn't actually have enough information. So how do we move forward? So essentially, these are 3 key strategies. So tailored resources and education. So when I say tailored, I use the term tailored actually because there are generally cultural differences in health-seeking behaviour amongst different communities. So providing culturally and linguistically appropriate education and resources can actually help motivate and empower these communities to navigate, the healthcare system, and also help them gain a better understanding of immunisation. And this is also important in the current climate with the COVID-19 vaccine in the works. We need to be transparent with our communication to build trust and achieve vaccine acceptance. The second recommendation is the appropriate dissemination of resources. So what I mean by this is that there is a need for, ethno-specific community organizations to play a greater role in the dissemination of health information. And the reason being is that these organizations are actually a key point of contact for these refugees and migrants, and they should be able to distribute such information. Another thing that we need to keep in mind is that it's worthwhile thinking about other avenues where such information can actually be disseminated. The last recommendation is funding for catch-up vaccines. I'm not sure how it works in the UK, but in Australia, catch-up vaccinations are actually free for refugees of all ages, but with migrants, it's not. So this is a key recommendation that probably needs to be implemented. So now I'll just go into like a few PhD tips. Surer actually kind of covered most of these already, so I won't go into too much detail. So I guess the first one would be to choose a good supervisor. So having a good supervisor during a PhD is crucial because you will need them to guide you in the right direction, as well as like they need to be there for you to help you with any other issues you may have. Another thing I've noticed is that, with a key mistake that a lot of students make is, for example, they would want to, work with a very popular academic in their field, a very prominent academic. And whilst this is very great in theory, they may not give you enough time and attention. So it's very important that you choose wisely. Existing projects versus, independent projects. So by this, what I mean is that I guess some labs and, some research groups actually have call outs for PhD candidates. And then in terms of independent projects, which is the route I took, is that you come up with your own research idea and then you shop around for supervisors. Another key tip is publishing. I know you guys hear this a lot, but you don't understand how important it is, both prior to your PhD and during your PhD. So having a lot of publications prior to your PhD actually makes you very competitive. publish old projects, contact old supervisors and ask them if there are any projects that they need help with, publish with your friends, publish on your own, like do a literature search, find a gap in the literature and write a systematic review on it. Sometimes you might not get accepted into journals, but if you keep trying, eventually I think you might be able to. The other tips, I guess, during your PhD, the key one is have a plan, but also accept that it will change. So decide on your goals early. So look at your, departmental guidelines and then establish like clear PhD aims and questions based on, the basis of your thesis requirements. And also be mindful that the goals can change a lot later, but a clear plan will actually help you maintain focus. Another important tip is, set expectations with your supervisor. So it's very important that you do discuss expectations with your supervisor because everyone works differently. Make sure, you know your needs and you communicate them with your supervisor early on so you can work productively together. Another very important tip is networking. Networking is so important. Attend departmental seminars, national conferences, international conferences. Generally, presenting might be a little bit scary at first, but it gets easier as you practice and present some more. And it's also a really fantastic way to network and also seek feedback on your work at the same time. It's also very important because a lot of the time, when you're shopping around for jobs or even postdocs, the job ad is usually a formality and they'll always end up giving it to someone they know. So it's very important that you do network. Another tip is publishing. Yes, so publishing some more. During your PhD, every time you finish like a project within your thesis, make sure you get it published, submit to a journal. Again, it might not work sometimes, but keep at it and you will get there eventually. And the last thing I wanted to, end with is learn when to say no. Like I cannot emphasize on this enough. I've seen a lot of PhD students are often scared to say no to their supervisors or their colleagues because they're afraid of fracturing, that relationship. And this can often lead to, overcommitment and burnout. So I do understand like how appealing it is, being offered to be a part of several exciting projects. But if you don't have the capacity to take it on, it's really okay to say no. Another opportunity will come at the right time. But yeah, so that's about it for my presentation. I hope it was insightful. So if you have any questions, I'll stick around for the Q&A. Feel free to connect with me.
Yeah, Ikram, thank you so much for this very informative talk and a very relevant talk as well, given the recent announcement of the COVID vaccine. So whilst we are collecting a few questions, I've got one or two I wanted to ask myself. Sure. So you talked about some of the factors which can contribute towards the low uptake of vaccinations within migrant and refugee communities. I was wondering if you had considered or factored in the people's attitudes towards the vaccination as to their perception in that some of the side effects of the vaccine could potentially mean that a lot of them are reluctant to take it themselves. So for example, within the UK, there's an alarming increase in the number of people refusing to take the BCG vaccine, for example, given that for some reason people believe that there's a link between autism and the uptake of the vaccination. So do you have any words on that?
Yes, absolutely. So perceptions do play an important role when it comes to vaccinations, and especially on that note with the whole autism thing and the MMR vaccine. So ever since that Wakefield paper came out that linked autism to the MMR vaccine, several other papers have also come out, disproving it. So I guess the key thing that I would say is that we shouldn't let fear dictate the decision to vaccinate. We shouldn't let perception dictate the decision to vaccinate. I know it's easier said than done, but rather we should help the community make an informed decision about vaccination by using, trusted spokespeople, holding workshops to explain the purpose of vaccinations, outlining the risks, the side effects. So yeah, I guess the key is to equip the people with the knowledge they need to make an informed decision about their health.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So there's a question from an audience member. So their question is, based on your experiences, how can we prepare the public for the COVID-19 vaccine program, specifically CALD communities? I'm not sure what that stands for.
Oh, yes, so CLD, culturally and linguistically diverse. I think you guys refer to it as BAME in the UK. But yeah, that's a very good question. Where do I even start? So it's one thing we have to acknowledge is that it's totally valid for people to have questions and concerns about the COVID-19 vaccine. So the first thing we will have to do is to acknowledge their concerns. So what are those concerns? So generally the most common concerns about vaccines in general and pandemic vaccines is its effectiveness and its safety because of the tight time frame that they're actually developed. And this can cause people to, think that the testing process has been rushed, and as a result, they'll perceive the vaccine as being unsafe. So I guess the key thing to do in this instance is that, public health messaging should be very transparent, and they should explain the safety of the testing process. The side effects should also be explained. These messages should then be tailored to refugee and migrant communities and also other people with specific communication needs. Another way, to prepare the public is using trusted spokespeople. So vaccine experts should be the ones communicating messages around vaccines. Research has also shown that, we are more likely to trust people that look like us and that represent us. So in our migrant communities, perhaps having prominent researchers or prominent healthcare workers to communicate the information about the COVID-19 vaccine would be very helpful.
Thank you for that. I think Dale has a question.
Yeah, so a question that came through is, you mentioned you wanted to go back home in the future. So what are your plans regarding that? And what kind of work do you plan on doing there?
Oh, yes, it will obviously be in the vaccine space. I know vaccinations are a real issue in Somalia and Somaliland. So I really want to go back there and do some projects there based around that. Yeah, sorry, that was a very vague response, but yeah, so just generally I guess equip them with the information that they need to, ensure that they become confident in vaccinations and they don't really fear it the way they currently do.
Right. No, thank you very much for that response. So we have a few other questions, but we're just going to keep them for the panel discussion afterwards, if that's okay.
Okay.
So we've got the final talk. So next up we have the amazing Dr. Kaltum Abdiaziz. So Kaltum is a postdoctoral researcher working at both Queen Mary University and Imperial College London. She's recently obtained a PhD in chemistry from Queen Mary University, and she's a recipient of several awards at conferences she's attended. And while she's not doing amazing work, she's often involved in doing multiple outreach programs and engaging with the general public.
Assalamu alaikum. Before I start, today I will introduce you to my PhD project, which is titled Development of a New Spectroelectrochemical Technique to Investigate Redox-Based Reactions called Film Electrochemical EPR. So I know that the title is very long-winded and it's complicated, but essentially it's the combination of two existing techniques that are widely used to understand protein mechanisms and to see if we can combine them and get the best of both worlds, essentially. So just a quick overview of my talk. I will talk briefly on why I chose this PhD project, the relevance that it has, and the two techniques that I attempted to combine, and then finally a conclusion. So why did I choose this PhD project and what really attracted me to it? My background is pharmaceutical chemistry, and within that, it has a lot of organic chemistry. And after doing that for my bachelor's and my master's, I realized organic chemistry is not for me. And so I wanted to branch out and learn something new. And I came across this project on findmeaphd.com, which Faisal mentioned yesterday. So, but yeah, and what really attracted me to it was that it was multidisciplinary. It combines material chemistry, which is the use of chemistry to design and fabricate materials with interesting properties. It also combined physical chemistry, which is a study of how matters behave on a molecular level, and it's how chemical reactions occur, and also biochemistry, which is the study of chemical reactions within or relating to living matter. So this is the main reason why I went into it. I wanted to learn something new, develop new techniques, develop new, oh my God. But yeah, and then this is why it attracted me. So why should we bother with combining or developing new techniques to understand chemical reactions? And the reason for that is that chemical reactions are all around us. They're not just in the lab. They are essential for life. They occur all the time in living organisms, and it's what's keeping you alive. It is heavily involved in the development of pharmaceutical drugs and also in the environment that we are living in. But also it's used in industry. So a lot of the stuff that you see on the shelves in the shops are basically because of chemical reactions and also the technology that you use today. So one key player in the world of chemical reactions is proteins, and these are naturally occurring complexes found in all living organisms. And they are responsible for life. So some examples, which I'm sure some of you have heard of them, are hormones, antibodies, and enzymes. So proteins are known to carry out chemical reactions with efficiency, specificity, and selectivity. And it's something that scientists are really trying to understand how proteins do their job and how they do it so well. I'm a little bit biased when it comes to proteins, so I think that enzymes are the most interesting kind of proteins, and the reason for that is that they catalyze chemical reactions in living organisms. So catalysis is literally trying to make a chemical reaction go faster. And I'm not the only one who finds enzymes interesting, because this is a really big market. And here is just a graph of the US industrial enzyme market of previous years and in the following years, and the projection that it will take. And in 2019, this market was worth 10 billion US dollars. So you could really see why people or scientists are trying to understand how enzymes do their job so efficiently. There are approximately 1,300 different enzymes in a human cell. That's a lot. And combined with coenzymes, which are these small molecules, you can form over 100,000 complexes. And all of them are vital for the function of a cell. And one in particular is respiratory complex 1. So this, in the world of enzymes, is a really big enzyme. My group particularly are interested in knowing how it works. And it's essential for the cellular energy production that occurs within your cell. And what was found was that any defects in this protein can lead to neuromuscular or metabolic disorders such as Parkinson's disease. The chemical reaction that it catalyzes is this, as followed, but it's very complex. But what's still not understood until today is how this protein does this job. And it's because of this reason why the development of new techniques is so important. So the two techniques I tried to combine are film electrochemistry and APR. On their own, these two techniques give a lot of information regarding the chemical reaction, whether that's kinetic or thermodynamic information on the chemical reaction or structural information. In the first technique, the protein you are interested in is immobilized on a conductive material, which we refer to as the working electrode. The example I've shown here is a ferredoxin NADP plus reductase. It's very important in photosynthesis and the regulation of photosynthesis. And my PhD, my postdoc position right now is trying to understand how this protein works in a plant cell. Now, most proteins have these small molecules called a redox cofactor, and these molecules are what is responsible for the channel of passage of electrons within the protein. The rest of the protein, shown in blue, is mainly for structural reasons. So I thought I would give you an example of how I would carry out an experiment an electrochemical experiment. So once you have immobilized your protein on the surface of your working electrode, you can scan a wide range of potentials. And what happens is once you get to a certain potential, electrons move from your working, from the redox cofactor to your working electrode. And then in the reverse scan, you do the opposite. So at a certain potential, electrons go from the electrode to your protein, and it's reduced. And so you can clearly monitor or visually monitor what is happening to your protein in this technique. So overall, it gives you detailed information on the chemical reaction. In theory, any protein can be investigated, and you typically require very low amounts, especially that proteins they don't come that easily. So the second technique is electron paramagnetic resonance. It's a spectroscopic technique, which means that it uses microwave radiation to study molecules with an unpaired electron. So here is a spectrometer. I have had to use one heavily in my PhD. And the benefits of this technique is that it gives you detailed information on the structure and the bonding of your complex. You can use it to monitor and confirm chemical reactions. And again, it requires very low samples. So I appreciate that these two techniques might seem difficult to understand, but so I'll give you an analogy. Imagine you have a horse running. Electrochemistry will tell you exactly how fast that horse is running. And EPR would give you snapshots of your horse all in different positions so that you can see how this horse is and why it's running so fast. But not only that, you'll be able to look at the environment that the horse is running in and understand how that environment affects how well it runs. So imagine this is a protein. Electrochemistry will tell us how well the protein catalyzes a reaction, and EPR will give us snapshots whilst it's catalyzing. So what next question would be, since I've claimed that these two techniques are perfect for each other in terms of understanding the mechanism of proteins, is why haven't they been combined before? And the reason for that is that they have opposite requirements. So film electrochemistry, you require maximum conductivity, and in EPR, conductive samples are avoided. And so the entire PhD project was based on finding a happy intermedium between these two techniques. So the overall design process of a new setup generally follows these few steps. So first you look at the literature to find inspiration and where to start. Then you come up with some kind of blueprint for your setup and choose the right material. And choosing the right material is crucial, especially in this case where you have two techniques that just do not work in favor of each other. Next, you would then go on to construct your setup and then finally do a test to confirm that your setup is working how you intended it to. And it's not as simple as going from one to another. Sometimes you just have to go back one step and then optimize it and go another step forward, but it generally follows this process. So first thing I did in my PhD was look at the literature, what has been done in terms of combining similar techniques, and then try to come up with a blueprint. So here I show you a few examples of setups that have been previously done. And this type of combining techniques has been around since the 1950s. But what I found was that in all examples, you cannot use them for proteins, and it was impractical to do an experiment on a protein using these setups. So using the literature, the first thing I did was decide to look at the materials that they used and decide on what material I should use for my setup. And the material I worked on was indium tin oxide. I don't know if you've heard of this molecule, but this molecule is present in all screens, whether that's a phone, that's a laptop, or your like on a plane. So yeah, so this is a very crucial compound. And the reason I decided to go for it was that it's a very versatile material. So you can tune it in terms of its structure, and more importantly, in terms of conductivity, since, like I said before, the two techniques I'm trying to combine have opposite requirements. So here is the summarized procedure on how I make my working electrode. Each step was optimized, and although it looks simple here, it did take the bulk of my PhD to come up with this procedure. And the final product is shown here. So this is what an electrode would look like. And you can use other characteristic techniques to look at the surface and characterize it in terms of its conductivity. So the next thing I did was, using my working electrode, was construct the entire setup. And here is a diagram of, or this schematic diagram of my setup. So here you've got your working electrode, and then you've got your surface, and you can attach your protein or whatever molecule you are interested in studying onto the surface. So the final step was to look at testing, and we used superoxide dismutase as a model system. And using this as our system, we were able to show that we have the first combined film electrochemical EPR setup. It was applicable to a protein, which was not done before, and more required very low amounts, so it was cost effective. But more importantly, we showed that we can directly and accurately affect or influence the protein that's on the surface of our electrode. So to conclude, I have, as part of my PhD, successfully developed the first film electrochemical EPR setup and showed that it's useful for studying proteins. The next steps would be to use it to understand the mechanism of our entire range of protein. So that, one, we can design and synthesize pharmaceutical drugs, especially for respiratory complex 1, since it's involved in Parkinson's disease, and ultimately improve the quality of life. But also, we wanted to use nature and the mechanism that nature does so well to help design and synthesize molecules for industrial use. So one field that I'm particularly interested in is artificial photosynthesis. Since everyone is trying to get away from fossil fuels at the moment, we are trying to go for a more greener approach. And since photosynthesis, plants do it so well, trying to understand how they do it would be pretty crucial, and again, improve the quality of life. So thank you for listening. I hope it made sense. And yeah, so if you want to get in contact with me, then these are my information.
Thank you so much for that, Kaltum. It was a very interesting talk. So again, whilst we're waiting to get the questions, I'll ask one or two, if that's okay.
Okay.
So to begin with, so your project is very interdisciplinary, and I know your group is very interdisciplinary as well, where you work in between two different institutions. I think even you've got some work going on with my supervisor as well through another postdoc. But so the question I'm trying to ask is, what is your experience in working between two different institutions, working on a project which requires different disciplines to come together as well? So you would need expertise in biology, physics, and chemistry, for example.
So, I mean, coming in from a organic chemistry background, I really had to learn more physical. We did basic physical principles in my undergrad. Materials, we did nothing, and bio, just a little bit. So I really had to get to know other people who have their expertise in certain fields, and really kind of use them as a teacher of some sort to understand and learn these new fields. So that was one thing. And one thing that was really good is that, so Queen Mary and the group that I was in contact at Queen Mary are very bio heavy. So it was really nice in terms of trying to purify proteins from, say, bacteria or plant-based. So so it was good to be in contact with them in terms of the bio side of my project. The material side, I had to make friends over at materials so that, and get expertise from there. So trying to get to know other people in different fields is really important in your PhD, and it helps a lot. So that was one thing that I learned in my PhD, was to get along with other people and try to dig out information from them. The internet is good, but sometimes it's just too detailed and you just need someone to simplify it for you. And so that's why getting in contact with other people is really important. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Another question is, so you've developed this new technique. Are there any plans in writing a patent for it, or is that even something you can do for this technique that you've developed?
So, we are trying to make it more user-friendly at the moment. So once we've got that, then yes, in the future, it would be something to patent. One way we could do that would be to get in contact with the manufacturers of the EPR spectrometers called Bruker. So they are really big in EPR. Well, the only manufacturers of EPR actually. And I've seen since we've published this work, a lot of people have got in contact with us to collaborate with us in terms of trying to understand mechanisms, because it's very versatile, which is one thing that previous setups did not have. It's that it can be used for anything, providing that it's surface bound. So so in the future, hopefully, we'll see.
I think Dale has a question as well you wanted to ask.
Yeah, just a question. By the way, I really like the horse analogy. I think that really simplified a lot of things. So yeah, just a quick question. So during the design process of this new tool, so which stage took the longest and which was the most difficult to do as well? Because I imagine there's multiple stages of developing and optimizing it.
Yeah. Funny thing is, up until my early parts of my third year, I really had the opinion that these two techniques should just stay separate. And that there's a reason why people haven't done it, and that they should not be married up. So the reason for that was because I've tried a lot of different, especially in the construction stage. It was the construction stage which was the most difficult. These two techniques required opposite. So if you optimize it for one technique, then the other technique is just not happy and it doesn't work. So finding a happy intermediate was really difficult. And that was the stage. It took me, 3 years, I think, the better part of 3 years, just to find a happy intermediate between the two. And then after that, once we've got that, it was pretty easy to the next couple of steps was pretty easy. But yeah, so it was that stage, the construction stage, which took the longest.
I see. Just actually a quick follow-up question on that. So is the sensitivity of the new tool that you developed, is it a compromise between the efficiency of either one or the other, or can it do both as well as them independently?
So it does both, which is the aim of my was the aim of my project. I have to say that it doesn't do well so far. Actually, in the last couple of months of my PhD, we showed that it does both equally as well. So it does it individually. Each technique, it works very well. Combined, it also worked very well. But it's not as easy as anyone can just go and do it. So I think that was the next hurdle, is to make it more user-friendly and replicatable, so that anyone from anywhere in the world can just follow a set of steps and do it themselves.
Okay, thank you for that answer.
Cool.
Thank you. So now we're gonna move on to the next segment of the event, and that is the panel discussion. So I would kindly request all the speakers to turn on their cameras. Okay, cool. So we're going to start off by asking sort of general questions for all speakers to answer. And then for the questions that the speakers weren't able to answer during their individual talks, we will repeat them during this part as well. So the first question to ask is, and I think Surya might have answered this in her talk, is prior to your PhD, did you have the research method skills that you would need? If not, how did it impact the early stages of your PhD journey?
So when I finished my Bachelor of Medical Science degree, I went straight into a Master's of Public Health and then straight into a research degree. So I didn't really have the necessary research skills at all. And I remember when I was shopping around for supervisors, like a lot of them were like, you know, you're too young to be starting a PhD, go and work as a research assistant for a bit, come back. But yeah, so I feel like that did initially impact my progress. But then I did an MPhil to kind of, you know, use that as a segue to get into my PhD. And then I did a study there and then I published, and then, yeah, and then I've been on this journey ever since.
I mean, mine was similar. I did my bachelor, and then straight after that, I did my master's, and then I applied for a PhD. And my master's served as my experience, a form of experience in the lab. So yeah, it was like just a one from one to another. That's literally, I think, how it was for me.
And then lastly, Surya, do you want to add to your answer previously?
Sure. I think a lot of this also has to do with the different country-specific relationships about what a PhD is. In North America, especially the social sciences, you have several years of study before you actually start your dissertation work, whereas in the UK, it's just the dissertation. It's about 3 years. And so in the United States or Canada, you might actually not need that much experience going into it because you might actually develop it over the course of it. And I think that also there was someone who was asking about whether you need a master's degree. A master's degree is necessary in the UK simply because that element of research or teaching is not built into the doctoral program itself. And so you actually have to transition that way, whereas in certain programs in the United States or Canada, you wouldn't need it. So it's all depending on like the specifics of your discipline, the specifics of the project that you're hoping to do and how technical the skills are that you need, as well as what you're hoping to accomplish. So I think those are really contingent processes. For me, I was ready to go by the time my PhD was starting, but there were a few skills that I picked up along the way as well.
Okay, thank you for your answers. So we have a question for Kaltum actually. So how are we able to stay motivated despite your technique or despite the aim of your PhD not working for the best part of your PhD itself?
I mean, as in Salah helps, I have to say, and just talk on Allah, you know. But it really did build my resilience in the field. Like PhD is really tough, and but yeah, I think it was just, if it works, it works. If it didn't, it didn't. And you have something to write in your thesis, you know? And you can explain why it didn't work and why, and all the methodology, all the different things you've tried. But yeah, I think a relationship with Allah is the cure for everything, I think. Yeah, so that was mainly it. And good friends, I have to say. Good friends is also, yeah.
Yeah, so I was just going to ask a question. So what would you advise someone that has a nascent interest in the field, but doesn't have a clear idea what to accomplish in a PhD specifically? That's for all panelists as well.
So I think the first thing would be to maybe conduct a literature review in the area. So see what's out there, see what studies have been done, see what papers have been written, try to identify a niche and identify a gap. If you're still stuck on, you know, how to develop a project based on that, look at similar projects as well to get an idea, and then just go from there.
Very similarly, I would argue reading is the most important thing there. I think if you read far enough into most things, you'll start to realize that there's actually a lot of different questions that are left to be engaged. And so in the social sciences, it would look more like thinking about the theoretical assumptions that someone has, or what kind of ways that they're entering the text or the empirical case study, and what ways could you do that better or do that differently. And then building upon that in order to think through what it is that you're trying to investigate. So if you have a nascent interest in the field, that's fantastic. That's really great, which means it'll sustain you while you're doing all of this grunt work of like trying to figure out what the field says about certain things and whether you agree with it. But it's just a matter of more reading. And whenever you see like certain questions, like often authors will flag up the limitations of their argument, right? Like, and that will be a good place for you to say, this person said that this is a limitation of their argument. I want to take that a bit further. I want to see what that has to do. And you can then develop a research project based on that as well.
I just have to say, read and try to find out more about what your interests are and exactly where they lie. I mean, I knew I wanted something different for me. I knew I didn't want organic chemistry, and I just jumped at it because I wanted to learn a wide range. And now, having done different aspects of chemistry, I know materials is more, and the bio is more for me than the physical. So you kind of just find your own niche or your own place that you're comfortable with and you enjoy. So
we have one question for Ikram, if I can find out. So someone asked, what's your opinion on the COVID vaccine, and do you have any concerns taking it?
So I think a COVID-19 vaccine will be, our best chance to reestablish the way of life we knew before, COVID-19. But positioning this vaccine as mandatory before it's even available, let alone, proven to be safe or effective, may seriously, affect public trust and also future vaccine acceptance as well. So I think I touched on this earlier as well. The first priority would be, communicating the safety and efficacy, of the COVID-19 vaccines, target groups being identified, and also the vaccine should be freely and easily accessible as well. And what was the second part of the question? Sorry.
Would you take it?
Would you? Of course I would. Yeah. So I would take it. In terms of the side effects of the vaccine, so as with any vaccine, they do cause some minor side effects such as redness and swelling, at the injection site. And I guess the key thing would be just to communicate these to the general public so that they don't feel misled at all.
Perfect. And so whilst we're on the topic of COVID, how has the recent lockdown affected you, your research? And that's a question open for all of you.
So it's affected a lot of my interviews for a lot of my studies. So interviews have been delayed, but I was also able to work on the other side of my thesis. So the epidemiology side of things, and also just actually work on writing and doing a lot of writing and reading as well.
And Sarah, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So I was in my third year, towards the end of my third year when the first lockdown happened in March this year. So alhamdulillah, I'd already done my field work, and so I had my data actually already in hand, and it was just a matter of I was finishing up my analysis and was starting my write-up process when everything happened. So there are a lot of people who are in much more difficult circumstances than I am. I can't access certain books and things like that, but I also have a relationship with certain librarians that I can ask them, and I'll be like, I'll give you a bunch of muffins when I see you next time, just scan these pages for me. Like, I have those relationships, whereas other people are starting their doctorates for the first time, or they had a whole plan about where they were going to go and what their interviews were going to be, and none of that's happening. And so there's a lot of questions around what this could mean for people who are conducting their doctorates right now and are in earlier stages. Alhamdulillah, for me, it's been a quite limit. It's just a matter of locking me in the house and not making, I can't have my desk anymore. That's really it. Alhamdulillah.
So for me, it was more, mine is heavily based in the lab. So the lockdown started towards the end of my funding. At a crucial bit, actually, I was doing some really important experiments for my thesis and trying to prove concepts in my thesis. So I wasn't able to do that. And as a result, my chapters were just open-ended. So it was more of a future outlook chapter. I think two of my thesis chapters had to be like a future look rather than clear-cut examples of proof. So yeah, it kind of affected me in terms of that. But I mean, you, like everybody else, it's understanding. My examiners were understanding of the situation, so it didn't affect my PhD journey or me passing my PhD. But yeah, so it was okay, I think. And it also came at a time where I had to write, so it was perfect timing as well. So yeah.
Yeah, so just while we're with you, Kaltum, just a question. So, so how can your work be translated to everyday use, and can that be potentially done in Somalia as well? And do you have plans of returning?
So, I mean, in everyday use, as in the first step of everything is trying to understand how things work, right? And a really clear inspiration in almost your everyday life is nature. Nature does certain things really well. For example, photosynthesis, which is just really one of the fundamental reactions that occur in nature that scientists till today don't understand how plants can do it so well. I mean, that would solve, understanding that would solve a lot of the pollution or say the non-renewable sources that we have and the electricity that we gain. So, I mean, in terms of everyday life, understanding what we can do and how we can use nature to inspire our daily life, I think that's where my project comes in. It's the first step that you need to do. And in terms of Somalia, I mean, I would love to go back to Somalia and help. I mean, Somalia has, from what I understood and what I've read, has a lot of potential. The land there has a lot of potential. And trying to understand how certain things work in Somalia, like certain crops grow in Somalia better than other places, that would be very beneficial for Somalia. I mean, so yeah, in the future, I would love to go back. I just haven't found what niche or what area to go into. But yeah, so inshallah, we'll see. We'll see.
Thank you for your answer. So just gonna swiftly move to Surar and ask a quick question. So in a social science PhD, and so it could be actually for both Surar and Ikram. So in a social science PhD, did you write parts of your final thesis as you went along each year, or did you do your writing at the end of your project?
So for me personally, I have to write to think through an argument. It's the only way that I can actually figure out whether it works, if that makes any sense. You have to write throughout the course of your doctorate. This is also, sorry, thank you for reminding me. This is a really important element of the doctoral process that they don't teach you about explicitly. Writing is really critical, and you have to learn, unfortunately, that not to get too attached to any specific writing that you're doing at any particular time. Sometimes it can become useful again later, and then you'll swap it back in. But especially for like an argument-based thesis, like a lot of the work will be in the social sciences, writing is critical. So you have to write all the way through in order to continue to demonstrate that your arguments have merit and that they're taking into account even the new literature that's popping up and being published at the same time as you're writing. And at the same time, you're going to find yourself going in completely new directions, and then pieces that you thought were really central to your thesis will somehow become less relevant. And so you have to fill up a new gap in order to be able to account for that. So yes, I wrote all the way through the course of the thesis. And now I'm trying to kind of reorganize all of the arguments that I have kind of scattered everywhere into something resembling a coherent single argument that goes from the beginning into the end and has some kind of theme, I suppose, is useful. So yeah.
Yes, I totally agree with what Surer said. It's very important to write throughout your PhD, especially with qualitative research. Like, it's very important to jot down all your ideas as you go along because it keeps changing. So one thing I do is that as I do write as I go along, but also in between interviews, because, you know, doing interviews take a really long time. So it's also very important that as soon as you have a couple of interviews, you know, conducted, you start analyzing those interviews, you start, you know, assigning themes, sub-themes, and then just continue the writing process.
No, thank you very much. So also, Kaltum, because your PhD was a bit difficult, let's say at first. How did you manage to write up your thesis near the end? How's that?
So as part of, I don't know about PhD in other parts of the world, but here you do have checkpoints. So you do have to do reports. So you do it in my PhD, we had to do it in 2 months into your PhD. You had to do a literature research review, and then 9 months is another one. 18 months, 36. So it's like a checkpoint in every year essentially. But I have to say I did most of my writing in lockdown, only because I was in the lab for the majority of my PhD, and so you didn't get enough time to write. And if you did get time, you would read rather than write. You would prioritize reading over writing. But I mean, once I think the hurdle or the difficulty is getting started. But once you've started and you formulate an idea in your head, it's really easy. And especially after doing it for 3.5 years, you know your project the most, and you are an expert in your own project. So it will come naturally. So I wouldn't stress to anyone who is writing. And anyone who's in a lockdown now, use time that you have now to get your literature review out of the way. The introduction is the bit that takes the most time, I found, whilst I was writing my thesis. And it's the most tedious part as well. So if you can do that and get that out of the way, the rest will be super easy.
All right, thank you for your answer. So I'm just going to ask Ikram a quick question. So how do you balance like teaching, working on your research, and working as a research assistant at the same time?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Sometimes I ask myself the exact same thing. But yeah, so like teaching is very flexible. It's only 4 hours a week. With the research assistant stuff, so whilst I'm waiting for my results from my other studies, I just do like small portions of those studies, because I'm the kind of person who likes to keep myself busy as well, because data collection, especially with, I think Surya can agree, like with social science research, it takes a really long time. So by teaching and doing, all these research assistant work on the side, like it really helps. I don't know, it keeps me busy, and sometimes I do get burnt out, I'll be honest, but I guess the end goal is that I will be getting publications out of these research assistant positions, and it will get my foot in the door, like in future, like for other positions in academia.
Perfect. So I've got a question myself. So one thing I found out starting my PhD is that it's quite easy to get lost in the literature. So you often have this tendency to try and read everything and feel like you need to understand so many different things. So I guess the question is, do you have any tips for people like myself who tend to find themselves lost in the literature and need more structure?
I mean, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
So for me, it was, I think mine was governed between like the different aspects of my PhD project. So I had to read a bit about physical chemistry, a bit about material chemistry, and a bit about biochemistry. So, but then there is a danger of going too much into one direction that you kind of neglect the other directions. So it's a bit, I mean, I have to say personally, I am not a good reader, or I don't learn things very well from reading. I have to talk it through with someone. So having someone in your group who's doing similar stuff to you really helps, and talking your ideas and talking through about the literature that you read, that was really helpful to me personally. But yeah, so reading is important, but I would say if you will understand or know from the abstract whether it's really important or not. You kind of, from reading and from experience, you kind of get a feel for certain things. And so it would be just to judge if it's important for you to know this at that point in your PhD. Is it important to know this piece of information? If it is, go ahead and read the rest of the article. If it's not, then you can just keep an eye on it and just put it on a back burner. But I think, yeah, so I would say read is good, but don't get too immersed in it that you forget other aspects of your PhD.
I totally agree with what you said. But another thing I wanted to add is that, so I remember when I was a first year PhD student, so 3.5 years ago, like I spent, I guess, a good 6 months just working on my literature review, fleshing it out, finalizing it. But what I've come to realize is that I revisited my literature review like a couple of months ago, and I was just appalled by the writing. So what happens is that you will change, like you will probably end up rewriting your entire literature review. So don't get bogged down into the details, and yeah, I guess just take it easy.
Yeah, I think those are all really excellent points. I think it's okay a little bit in your first year to get to read a lot, as long as it's not coming from a place of anxiety and feeling like you're never gonna know. Like there is a possibility you can just continue to read forever, and that's not the same as doing a doctorate. That's true, but I think there is something very valuable about developing a sense of what the literature thinks about certain kinds of ways, or a sense of what kind of arguments are out there, and being able to do that. One thing I will say, and like from my 4th year experience, I did a lot of that kind of anxious reading in my first year. And because I was reading it, and because I was kind of reading similar things, I thought that it was going to be intuitive and obvious to me, and I didn't take as detailed notes as I should have. And now in the process of like revisiting that, I have these like general senses of what it is that I was thinking at that time, but I don't really have the benefit of that that kind of detailed note taking that I would have taken if looking back. So one thing that I would say is if you have Zotero, which is a free app, you can just put articles, book notations, and things like that. There's a web connector on your Google Chrome browser. You can use Google Scholar to just go ahead and pop those in there. It can generate a PDF copy for you as well. And then you can use that to kind of sift through different kinds of ideas and sort through the different kinds of themes that you're dealing with. Because often we're sitting at the intersections of different kinds of academic conversations, in addition to trying to develop our own arguments. And so we can have trouble placing where what argument fits, if that makes sense. So it becomes also very helpful to kind of organize your thoughts if you have, I suppose, a folder for like, this is my thinking on urbanism, this is my thinking on conflict in urbanism, and this is my thinking on memory in urbanism, and having those things kind of distinct. So yeah, it's okay to read. Your supervisor will tell you when to stop reading. He told me. Like everybody I know had a moment where their supervisor was just like, and that's enough. Thank you very much. Time for you to start writing things.
Thank you for that. And very quickly, whilst we're on the theme of the literatures, so someone asked a question, so how big should a literature review be in a thesis?
I mean, it is a big chunk of your thesis. I mean, I would say from all the theses that I have seen, PhD theses I've seen, it's roughly around, I don't know, maybe 30 to 40 pages. I think I wrote mine around that. But again, it's more getting your point across rather than like the length of it. But mine was specifically long because I was trying to introduce 2 separate techniques and explain why they are good on their own, but then combine why it's even better. But I wouldn't worry too much about. There's no limit or there's no restriction, shall I say, on your literature review. So just write. If it gets your point across, that's the most important bit.
And I also just wanted to add, so I don't know how it is in the UK, but like here in Australia, like different universities have different requirements for the literature review. So for instance, at my university now, the literature review should be like 15 to 30% of the whole thesis. So that would probably be around like 50 to 60 pages.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it's quite a bit, yeah.
No, there's no restrictions here in the UK, so we're lucky.
So I guess it just depends on the university you go to as well.
The last thing I'd say is it's also discipline specific. So those kinds of cues about those kinds of things your supervisor should be helping you with. And if they're not, then that's something to also reevaluate your relationship with your supervisor. They should be able to guide you in that sense of like what seems about right, what makes the most sense. And that's what their job is as well. So if you're overwriting or underwriting, that's that person's job to let you know.
So one more question, because I see we're getting closer towards 4 o'clock. So someone asked, so how do you balance your PhD and your hobbies?
Okay, I'll go first. I think it's a journey. So sometimes your hobbies do take the back seat. But I mean, it's really important, especially if you're doing a lab-based PhD, to like be firm with yourself, you know, like there is a time allocated to the lab, there's a time allocated to your work life, but also give yourself a social life or a life outside your PhD. I mean, I've seen a lot of people who have been consumed by their PhD. But yeah, I think it's really, really important to have a balance or of some sort. But keep your hobbies, try to keep doing them. Exercise is also really good. I found that to be a break from your PhD, a mental break. That's also really important. And going abroad, that's one thing that PhD offers. Go abroad, you know, travel. Like, there are times where you should just not focus on your PhD. Yeah.
I would just say the balance was hard for me. One of the most beautiful things that Ikram said during the course of her talk was about saying no. And I very much wish that this was something that I was a part of when I started my PhD, because I didn't know how to say no at that point. So I got involved with a lot of different stuff, things that became incredibly important and super valuable to me. But thinking now, I might have taken up a little bit less of my time. So we all go through it. I think one of the main things is being able to account for your time, thinking through a doctorate as something that you actually have to commit a certain amount of effort to, work to, and time to, thinking time, on a regular basis, right? And so, because Ikram was talking about setting up deadlines with your supervisors, that's really critical, because there's any particular moment that you could be working on this, or you could be doing your PhD. You could be doing this, or you could be doing your PhD, and that can sink you as well. So in addition, like finding a workflow that works for you, finding a workspace that works for you. Also, it was really important to me to also have other things going on, things that didn't involve me thinking by myself, and feeling in some sense like I was a representative of an entire community, and that I had so much on my shoulders, and that there's a lot of pressure that goes with doing that kind of work, and you can kind of get into a tailspin about it. And so having other spaces where you're not like a doctoral candidate, and instead are just like a normal human being using and demonstrating normal competence, can be incredibly helpful and super validating as well. And like, so that could be creative, that could be exercise, that could be spiritual, all of those different ways. For me, it was really necessary.
I really have much to add, but I do agree with the girls. Like, it's very important to ensure that your whole world doesn't revolve around your PhD. Like, remember, you do have a life. There will be times, you know, where you're completely burnt out. Take a break, like Kaltum said, go on a holiday. You know, international conferences are very helpful. Like, you can go and network at the same time, but also take a quick break to take your mind off things. But yeah, so I'm a chronic procrastinator, so I do always make time for my hobbies. But it's also very helpful just having a supportive network around you. So friends who aren't necessarily PhD colleagues, but to, I guess, yeah, so like to just support you and ensure that, you know, so I guess the take home message here is just don't make sure the world doesn't revolve around your PhD, because there's more to life than that. Otherwise, you'll get so bogged down in the details, and then it's not good for your mental health. So it's important to consider that as well.
Yeah, so we have other questions, but unfortunately, we won't be able to answer them here. So what we can do is, for the attendees, we'll forward them onto our panelists, and hopefully they'll be able to get back to you all. So yeah, so we just like to wrap up the event, and a massive thank you to all the speakers, so Ikram, Dr. Abdiaziz and Surer for joining us, and special thanks to Ikram for joining us at 1 a.m. from
It's
Australia.
actually 3 a.m. now.
3 a.m.
Yeah, so I'm gonna, yeah.
Yeah, so thanks for joining us. And also for our attendees, if you haven't seen Surah's podcast with her sister on the things we left behind, please do give it a listen. I'm not really into podcasts, but that's one that really captivated me. So please check that out. And thanks for Dr. Abdiaziz for joining us as well and sharing her brilliant discoveries in the fields of chemistry. And so yeah, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll call it a day.
Very quickly as well.
Yeah.
Very quickly, I would like to thank the team as well. So a lot of the work that's gone into this has been done by Dale himself, Iman, Maymoon, Nazra, and Amran as well. So I'd like to thank all of them for helping make this event a success as it is. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you
Okay,
guys
cool.
for facilitating this. That was really great. Thank you.